On the morning of November 1st, 1755, most of Lisbon was in church. It was All Saints' Day, one of the most observed holy days in the Portuguese Catholic calendar. The city's population, somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 people, had dressed, walked, and taken their seats. Candles had been lit. Prayers had already begun. At approximately 9:40 in the morning, the ground started to move, not like a tremor, not a brief shudder that passes and is forgotten. The shaking lasted somewhere between 3 and 6 minutes, depending on which surviving account you read. In a city built largely of stone, timber, and tile, 3 to 6 minutes is enough to bring almost everything down. The quake's epicenter was out in the Atlantic, roughly 200 kilometers southwest of Cape St. Vincent. Seismologists today estimate its magnitude somewhere between 8.5 and 9.0, though that kind of measurement didn't exist in 1755. What existed in 1755 was the sound, the dust, and the immediate silence afterward. Then the fires started. The overturned candles from All Saints' Day services. The cooking hearths. The bakery ovens left burning that morning. Fires don't need much help in a city where the streets are narrow and the buildings share walls. Within hours, multiple fires had merged into something that would burn for days, and then, perhaps 40 minutes after the first shock, the sea pulled back. People near the waterfront, curious or desperate for open ground, watched the harbor drain in front of them. What followed was a tsunami, possibly 3 waves striking the lower city and the waterfront districts. The Baixa, Lisbon's lower commercial quarter, was already rubble and flame before the water arrived. For a city that was, at that moment, one of Europe's wealthiest port capitals, the timing was almost surgical in its damage. Lisbon in 1755 was not a provincial town. It was the administrative center of a global empire, connected by sea to Brazil, to West Africa, to India, to Macau. The gold coming through Lisbon's customs house was helping finance Portuguese royal ambition across 3 continents. The earthquake did not distinguish between the wealthy and the poor, but it did concentrate its destruction on the lower city. The higher districts, the Alfama hillside, some of the upper neighborhoods fared somewhat better structurally. Estimates of the dead vary considerably depending on the source. Contemporary accounts suggested tens of thousands. Some modern historians place the figure between 10,000 and 20,000 for Lisbon alone. Others, accounting for the surrounding region and the tsunami's reach along the coast, push the total higher. The uncertainty is real. The record-keeping infrastructure was itself largely destroyed. Within days, 2 competing pressures emerged in the Portuguese government. One was theological. If God had destroyed Lisbon on All Saints' Day, while the people were in church, what did that mean? The Jesuit priest Gabriel Malagrida argued, with considerable conviction, that the earthquake was divine punishment for the city's moral failures. That interpretation had weight. It had precedent. It was also, from a policy standpoint, completely useless. The man who would push back against it, and against nearly everything else standing in the way of reconstruction, was Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo. He held the title of Secretary of State. He would later be known as the Marquis of Pombal, and that is generally what history calls him. Pombal's response to the disaster is often reduced to a single famous line: bury the dead and feed the living. The attribution is disputed, and the phrasing likely smoothed over time, but the policy direction it describes was real. Within days of the earthquake, Pombal had organized the removal of corpses by sea burial to prevent epidemic. He had imposed price controls on basic goods to prevent the starvation and profiteering that typically followed urban catastrophe. He had issued orders preventing citizens from fleeing the city, recognizing that a mass exodus would collapse what remained of the economy. And he had begun organizing a survey. This part tends to get less attention than it deserves. Pombal sent questionnaires to parishes across Portugal, asking specific, uniform questions about the quake. How long did the shaking last? How many waves came? Which buildings stood and which fell? Were wells affected? Did animals behave strangely beforehand? It was, in practical terms, one of the earliest systematic attempts to collect earthquake data across a wide geographic area. The motive was not purely scientific curiosity. Pombal needed to know where to rebuild, what had failed structurally, and how to prevent repetition. But the method was empirical, standardized, and deliberately separate from the theological explanation, competing for authority at the same time. That tension between providential interpretation and practical investigation is one of the things that makes 1755 a genuinely significant moment in how European institutions began to think about disaster. It did not resolve cleanly. It rarely does. The reconstruction of Lisbon was not left to grief and gradual recovery. Pombal moved with a speed and administrative force that was unusual even by the standards of absolute monarchy. Within weeks, architects and military engineers were producing plans for what the lower city should become. The design that emerged was geometric, rational, and deliberately unlike what had stood before. Wide streets on a grid, uniform building heights, standardized facades, a city shaped not by centuries of organic growth, but by a single coordinated decision made under pressure. The new Baixa Pombalina, as it came to be called, still stands largely intact today. You can walk it and see the regularity, the consistent cornice lines, the proportioned windows repeating block after block. What is less visible from the street is what was engineered underneath and inside the walls. Pombal's engineers developed a timber cage structure, a gaiola pombalina, embedded within the masonry of new buildings. The idea was that the flexible wooden frame would absorb seismic movement rather than transmitting it rigidly through stone. Whether this was based on direct observation of which structures had survived or on engineering intuition, historians still discuss. What is documented is that these specifications were mandated, not suggested. Buildings that did not conform to the new standards were not approved. That is a meaningful line to cross, from advice to enforcement, and Lisbon crossed it in the 1750s. It is, depending on how you define the term, one of the earliest examples of seismic building regulation in the Western world. The regulation did not emerge from calm deliberation in a university or a learned society. It came from rubble, from the pragmatic observation that some things had stood and most things had not. That is often how building codes actually begin, not from foresight, but from documented failure. Meanwhile, the theological argument was losing ground, not through debate, but through displacement. Pombal systematically weakened the Jesuits' influence in Portugal over the years following the earthquake. Malagrida, the priest who had argued most publicly for divine punishment as the explanation, was eventually arrested, tried by the Inquisition, and executed in 1761. The charges were heresy, which had a certain historical irony given that Malagrida had been arguing for more religion, not less. But Pombal was not interested in theological nuance. He was clearing the field. By the early 1760s, the Jesuits had been expelled from Portugal and its empire entirely. The earthquake had not caused this exactly, but it had accelerated a political conflict that was already building. Disaster in this case became a lever. Far from Lisbon, in Geneva and Paris, writers and philosophers were processing what 1755 meant. Voltaire had been working on a long philosophical poem when news of Lisbon reached him. He redirected it. The Poème sur le désastre de Lisbonne appeared in 1756. Its argument was pointed. If this world is the best of all possible worlds, as Leibniz and the optimists had claimed, then what exactly was Lisbon? Voltaire was not inventing the problem of evil. Theologians had been debating it for centuries. But the earthquake gave it a specific, recent, undeniable address. 20,000 dead on a holy day in one of Europe's great Christian capitals, while at prayer. The abstraction became concrete, and the concrete was very hard to argue around. Rousseau responded, somewhat contrarily, that the death toll reflected human choice as much as natural force. People had chosen to build a dense city of tall stone buildings in that location. Nature had not forced them to cluster there. The exchange between Voltaire and Rousseau on Lisbon was, among other things, an early public argument about human responsibility in natural disaster. That argument has not ended. What Lisbon 1755 represented, in accumulated effect, was a shift in the grammar of how governments and intellectuals understood catastrophe. Before, disaster was primarily interpreted. After Lisbon, it increasingly began to be measured, surveyed, regulated, and planned around. Not immediately everywhere, not completely even in Portugal. But the direction had changed. The Pombaline questionnaires fed into what would later become seismology as a discipline. The building codes fed into what would eventually become structural engineering standards. The emergency price controls and organized relief fed into debates about state responsibility during crisis. None of these things were invented by the Lisbon earthquake, but several of them were clarified, accelerated, or formalized because of it. As with most historical turning points, the cleaner the story sounds, the more carefully you should read the footnotes. Some historians argue Pombal's reforms were more about consolidating royal and state power than enlightened disaster management. Both things can be true simultaneously, and probably were. What remains is the city itself, rebuilt on a grid, with timber frames inside its walls, on ground that had already proven it could move. The earthquake of 1755 did not teach Europe that disasters happen. It helped push the question of what to do about them into the hands of administrators, engineers, and planners, rather than leaving it entirely to providence. That shift, incomplete and contested as it was, is why November 1st, 1755, still appears in the literature of disaster policy, urban planning, and the history of science. As always, accounts of the earthquake vary depending on the source, and some details, including casualty figures and the precise origins of Pombal's policies, remain debated among historians.